Ruth chapter 2, beginning in verse 1. Scriptures say, "Now Naomi had a kinsman on her husband's side, a prominent rich man of the family of Elimelech, whose name was Boaz. And Ruth the Moabite said to Naomi," now Ruth has already left Moab and she's committed herself to Naomi and Naomi's God, but the text wants us to know she's a Moabite, and that's important. We need to remember that detail. "And Ruth the Moabite said to Naomi, 'Let me go to the field and glean among the ears of grain, behind someone in whose sight I might find favor.' She said to her, 'Go, my daughter.' So she went. She came and gleaned in the field behind the reapers. As it happened, she came to the part of the field belonging to Boaz, who was of the family of Elimelech. Just then Boaz came from Bethlehem. He said to the reapers, 'The Lord be with you.' They answered, 'The Lord bless you.' Then Boaz said to his servant who was in charge of the reapers, 'To whom does this young woman belong?' The servant who was in charge of the reapers answered, 'She is the Moabite who came back with Naomi from the country of Moab.' She said, 'Please let me glean and gather among the sheaves behind the reapers.' So she came, and she's been on her feet from early this morning until now, without resting even for a moment." Then Boaz said to Ruth, "Now listen, my daughter. Do not go to glean in another field or leave this one, but keep close to my young women. Keep your eyes on the field that is being reaped and follow behind them. I've ordered the young men not to bother you. If you get thirsty, go to the vessels and drink from what the young men have drawn." Then she fell prostrate with her face to the ground and said to him, "Why have I found favor in your sight that you should take notice of me when I am a foreigner?" But Boaz answered her, "All that you have done for your mother-in-law since the death of your husband has been fully told me, and how you left your father and mother and your native land and came to a people that you did not know before. May the Lord reward you for your deeds. May you have a full reward from the Lord, the God of Israel, under whose wings you have come for refuge." Then she said, "May I continue to find favor in your sight, my Lord, for you have comforted me and spoken kindly to your servant, even though I am not one of your servants." At mealtime, Boaz said to her, "Come here and eat some of this bread and dip your morsel in the sour wine." So she sat beside the reapers, and he heaped up for her some parched grain. She ate until she was satisfied, and she had some left over. When she got up to glean, Boaz instructed his young men, "Let her glean even among the standing sheaves, and do not reproach her. You must also pull out some handfuls for her from the bundles and leave them for her to glean, and do not rebuke her." So she gleaned in the field until evening. Then she beat out what she had gleaned. It was about an ephah of barley. She picked it up and came into the town, and her mother-in-law saw how much she had gleaned. Then she took out and gave her what was left over after she herself had been satisfied. Her mother-in-law said to her, "Where did you glean today? And where have you worked? Blessed be the man who took notice of you." So she told her mother-in-law with whom she had worked and said, "The name of the man with whom I work today is Boaz." Then Naomi said to her daughter-in-law, "Blessed be he by the Lord, whose kindness has not forsaken the living or the dead." Naomi also said to her, "The man is a relative of ours, one of our nearest kin." Then Ruth the Moabite said, "He even said to me, 'Stay close by my servants until they have finished all my harvest.'" Naomi said to Ruth, her daughter-in-law, "It is better, my daughter, that you go out with his young women. Otherwise, you might be bothered in another field." So she stayed close to the young women of Boaz, gleaning until the end of the barley and wheat harvest, and she lived with her mother-in-law. Now, what maybe was not apparent is that we're told at the beginning of Boaz, and Naomi certainly knew of him, but when she sent Ruth out to glean, she did not know where to send her. She did not send her to Boaz's field. Ruth simply goes out looking for a field in which gleaning was allowed. So the good and godly people were supposed to leave some of their produce there in the field so that the poor could come through and collect some. So a good and godly person would not glean all of their produce. They would leave some margin. And also, they were not to go over their fields a second time, because everything is not always ripe all at once. And they were not supposed to go over it a second time. They weren't supposed to clear cut. They were to leave it. Now, it seems clear in the history of Israel that a great many Israelites who knew that law didn't care. They did not leave room for gleaning. And that's what Ruth is worried about, and Naomi too. It's not going to be easy to find a field where the people in the days of the judges are living according to the law of Moses. There are not a lot of godly people in this day. And one of the most godly things you can do is risk your own wealth for the poor. So there's probably maybe Boaz is 1 in a million here, or maybe 1 in 100,000. He's probably not common. And the Lord guides Ruth to his field. What's maybe not as obvious is that Boaz too is alone. He's a godly man, we're told. He's a wealthy man, but as far as we can tell, he has no children and he has no wife. At least they're never brought up. And he seems to be a man alone in his time. There are not many people who are godly in the days of the judges. And Boaz himself might be a rare person. And so there are two things going on in this story that we have to pay attention to. Ruth is looking for someone who will actually be godly in a very ungodly time, and the odds of finding someone are slim. And Boaz is probably looking for someone who shares his values in an ungodly time, and that's probably just as unrealistic an expectation. It may even be why he remains unmarried. Proverbs chapter 20, verse 6 summarizes some of what we've been talking about. It says, "Many proclaim themselves loyal, but who can find one worthy of trust?" That is the story of Ruth and Boaz. As we journey with Ruth into the fields outside of Bethlehem, we'll consider first the shepherding of God, second the sheep of God, and third the celebration of the godly. Those are the points. Let's look back at chapter 2, verse 2, as we consider the shepherding of God. "And Ruth the Moabite said to Naomi, 'Let me go to the field and glean among the ears of grain behind someone in whose sight I might find favor.'" Now, we've already addressed this. There are certainly scholars who believe, and readers, and I'm sure preachers, who believe Ruth went out to look for Boaz's field. But it does not seem that's the way the story is told. We're simply told that Boaz exists. My sense is that Ruth, being young and strong enough, decided that Naomi was too weak and too elderly to glean effectively, so she chose to glean for the both of them. When she says she's looking for someone in whose eyes I find favor, that probably indicates, as we've already talked about, that not all landowners allowed for gleaning, and she was hoping to find someone who would not pester her. It's one thing to be a poor man in Israel. It's a whole other thing to be a poor woman in Israel at this time. And she is at great risk going out into these fields. Anything could happen to her, and she would have no one to stand for her. It's a very vulnerable position, and she does it on behalf of Naomi. It's really Naomi's place to do the gleaning. She's the Israelite. But Ruth volunteers to take the risk herself. So when she says she hopes she finds a field in which she finds favor, what she means is she hopes she finds someone who will not harm her. Ruth went out looking for a landowner gracious enough to permit her to pick up the scraps left by the harvesters, and gracious enough not to harm her. And she found the field of Boaz. She went looking for a godly person, for somebody who followed the law in a time where nobody did and nobody had to. A person who could be trusted to treat a vulnerable woman with dignity. That's what she went looking for. And the text indicates that it was God who led her to Boaz. That's the phrase, "it just so happened that." Now, if you are reading the scriptures in the First Testament and you read "it just so happened that," there's somebody behind that. God is profoundly meek. He's behind the scenes. And one of the ways that in the First Testament, what's often called the Old Testament, in the Hebrew Bible, God is depicted is through what's called the divine passive. In the divine passive is when we talk in the passive tense, and what we mean to say is that God is actually working. And that's what happens here. It just so happens that she found Boaz. What actually happened was God guided her there. In Boaz, we see that holiness is safety in a dangerous place. The real goal of holiness is not that holy people would think of themselves as better, but that God would have a safe place to send people when the world is falling apart. We follow the law of Moses and the law of Jesus because we understand that if we live in these ways, we live in a space demarcated by the Word of God, which is always safer for people than to live outside of God's boundaries. There could not have been many Boazes in the world, but praise God there was one. We don't know the story if there weren't. The world is a dangerous place, and there are very few places God can send the vulnerable in a world like ours. And if the people of God will not be holy, if they will not live according to God's laws, then there will be no place God can send a vulnerable person for help. Are there any Boazes today? God will shepherd his people to the holy because he can trust them. Let's think about what it means to be one of God's sheep. This is Ruth chapter 2, verses 8 through 18, but I'm going to start in verse 11. It says, "But Boaz answered her, 'All that you have done for your mother-in-law since the death of your husband has been fully told me, and how you left your father and mother in your native land and came to a people that you did not know before. May the Lord reward you for your deeds, and may you have a full reward from the Lord, the God of Israel, under whose wings you have come for refuge.'" Not only in God's providence did Ruth find a gracious landowner who permitted gleaning, but she found one who had heard of her commitment to Naomi and recognized in her a commitment to the same Lord as he had committed himself to. Now, the scriptures teach us, and I'm assuming Boaz knows this, because he allowed gleaning on his fields for anybody. There were already people gleaning when he came, and that is what Jesus says we are to do as well. We are to be generous with everybody who has need. We're not to discriminate between people based on their faith commitments or based on our estimation as to their worthiness or anything like that. We are to have a general hospitality and generosity to the needy of the world. That is the general Christian orientation, and that's true. But not every person who comes to us in need comes from God. Not everyone who comes asking for bread has been sent by God. We are to be generous, no matter if a person is sent by God or whether they've crawled there on their own. But not all are sent by him. Boaz knows God sent Ruth. How does he know? Because of how Ruth was living. Boaz knew that Ruth had been sent by God because of the quality of Ruth's faith. He saw the sacrifices she had made to be loyal to Naomi. He saw that her commitment to the God of Israel was not peripheral or just lip service. She was out there in the fields working her tail off to take care of the woman she had covenanted to be with. And so he knew that this was a godly woman, even though she was a Moabite. And he recognized in her chesed to Naomi the same chesed he had come to recognize in his own God. And so he knew because of her character who she was. And he knew God had sent her. And he knew that when God sends somebody, you must care for them lavishly. Now, you might be tempted to believe that Boaz was simply doing this because he hoped to get Naomi's land. I've heard people say that. But Boaz is already wealthy, and he doesn't initiate any conversation with Ruth about the land of Naomi. It's Ruth who's going to make that initiative, and Naomi who wants him to be the kinsman redeemer. That's going to come later. But there was a nearer relative who had more right to that property, and Boaz doesn't seem to be seeking it. His lavishness here is simply because he recognized that the one who had come into his field was not like the others who had come in. This one was God's. And he had to care for this one the way he would care for God himself. And he did it. And funny enough, Ruth and Boaz, and I'm giving away the end of the story. Sorry if there are spoilers if you don't know this story, but they eventually will marry, and we'll get into the details of how that occurs. And they'll have a child. The child's name is Obed. And that child will have a child, and his name is Jesse. And that child will have a child, and his name is David. Ruth will be in the line of the Messiah. And Jesus knew his family story well. Parable of the sheep and the goats. Couple of items in that story that make it a very interesting one. First, it's not the judgment of Israel that's at stake there. It says he will gather the nations. So most of your subtitles in your Bibles will say it's the judgment of Gentiles. And most Jewish people believe that Gentiles would be judged primarily based on how they treated Israel. Jesus does a little turn on them there where he says that the Gentiles will be judged based on how they treat Jesus, brothers and sisters. Not based on how they treat Israel, but Jesus, brothers and sisters. And in the Gospel of Matthew, Jesus, brothers and sisters are the ones who do the will of his Father. So in the parable of the sheep and the goats, Jesus is actually telling us something that occurs here in his own family history in the flesh, in the story of Ruth and Boaz. It's that if God sends somebody and they get put in prison, if God sends somebody and they're starving, if God sends somebody and they're hungry, and you don't care for them, I will judge you. And it's no wonder he says it then, because he's leaving his disciples in a very vulnerable position, and he's warning the Jewish people that how they care for his disciples will be how they will be judged. This is not a story new to the teachings of Jesus. Jesus is reminding us of the deep truths that are in the scriptures from the beginning. When God sends someone to your field, you help them as much as you possibly can. And that's what Boaz did. He didn't help Ruth just because she was needy, but because she was one of God's needy. And you'll see that in the story of the New Testament as well, when Paul says, be hospitable to everyone, especially to those of the family of faith. Should we be generous to everyone? Yes, Boaz allowed gleaning in his field no matter who came into it. But when God sends someone, special attention is merited. And that's the story of the sheep and the goats, and it's the story of Boaz and Ruth. Ruth's loyalty to Naomi and her faithfulness and her work revealed who had sent her. Because you will know a tree by its fruit. You will know whether someone has been sent by God based on the fruit of their lives. And Boaz was one of God's sheep too, because he recognized it. Boaz recognized Ruth. The wicked do not recognize the sheep of God. They do not recognize his voice in them. But the godly do. The faithful should seek to repay loyalty to God with lavish loyalty from ourselves. We as followers of Jesus should look to reward those who have sacrificed much for the values that God has commended to us. Finally, the celebration of the godly. Look at Ruth chapter 2. This comes from verses 19 to 23. I'm going to read verse 20. Then Naomi said to her daughter-in-law, "Blessed be he by the Lord, whose kindness has not forsaken the living or the dead." Naomi also said to her, "The man is a relative of ours, one of our nearest kin." Naomi revealed to Ruth that Boaz was a near relative of her late husband, and that in part his watch care over her may have been because of family loyalty. That's what Naomi believed. And it's true that Boaz would have been expected to show faithfulness to Elimelech's family to some degree, and he certainly did that. But the surprise of the story to this point is that Boaz decided to go so far beyond any reasonable cultural expectation. What he does here is beyond the pale. This is not generosity, this is lunacy, what he does with one gleaning in his field. Historians tell us that gleaning was normally allowed after the harvest. Men would go through the fields cutting down the stalks. Servant girls would follow behind them, and they would gather up the stalks and bind them together. And only after that group had gone through the fields were the gleaners allowed to come and just pick up the scraps that had fallen down. But Boaz permitted Ruth to follow immediately after the young women, which means she was the very first gleaner. And he even instructed them to leave some of the stalks behind. So rather than wrapping up all of the stalks, they left some deliberately behind them for Ruth to gather. He also gave Ruth access to the laborer's water supply, which was never done, as well as inviting her to eat with his workers. And the text tells us that Ruth went home with an ephah of barley. That is, to the best estimates of today's scholars, between 30 and 50 pounds of barley. Why did Boaz go so far and beyond? Well, the text tells us it was not because he was hoping for Ruth's land. It was not because he was interested in her as a potential marriage partner. It's not even because she was Naomi's daughter. He tells Ruth specifically why he did it, and it's because of her chesed, her loyalty to Naomi, and the risk that she had taken to leave Moab and become an Israelite loyal to the God of Israel. It was for that he did this. As I said, we help everyone out of our love for God. But when we find one God has sent, we recognize we will be judged based on how we treat that person. It seems to me that one of the things that limits holiness in the church today among Christians who claim faith in Jesus is we are always looking for the bare minimum of what we have to do to be considered good enough. Now, can you imagine if Ruth ran into somebody like that, who was reading the law of Moses for the loopholes, who was reading the law of Moses for the bare minimum he had to do to be considered godly? Can you imagine if she ran into such a human being? The whole history of Jesus' flesh on earth would have been different. The whole history of Israel would have been changed. No David. No line of David. Maybe no Jerusalem. How long would the United Kingdom have lasted? We don't know. Because thankfully, Boaz was not one who was looking to do as little as he possibly could get away with and still be considered a follower of God. Boaz was interested in how much he could get away with doing, not how little he could get away with doing. And we could use more Boazes in Christianity today. Can you imagine a faith like that of Zacchaeus? You remember the story in the New Testament of Zacchaeus? Zacchaeus was a tax collector, and tax collectors were notorious for doing as much as they could to make money and as little as they could to save people on taxes. That's what he was known for. And Jesus came to his house, and he was so overwhelmed by the gospel. Do you remember what he said? He said, I'm going to pay back 4 times everything I've taken illegitimately. 4 times! That's way beyond the law. What does the law require? 2 different passages. Either double, which is the most required by the law, or 1.5 times. There are 2 different passages. One's in Numbers and the other is in Exodus. But in any case, double was the maximum that he would have to pay back, and he doubled the double. This is a man who went beyond what was necessary. This is what Jesus is talking about in his Sermon on the Mount. When he says that if someone asks you to go 1 mile, you should go with them 2. If someone asks for your cloak, give them your tunic as well. What Jesus is trying to say is not lay down some new law. Okay, great, then I'll give him my coat and my shirt and we'll be good. What he's saying is you need to go beyond what's expected. We preached on this when we preached through the Sermon on the Mount, because a Roman soldier could require a person in those days to carry his gear for a mile, but he couldn't go further than that. And what Jesus is saying is if you're required to go a mile by the law, go 2 miles by grace. Go beyond what is expected of you. Don't simply meet expectations, exceed them. And that's what Ruth found in Boaz, a man who was not looking for the bare minimum requirements to be a follower, but a man who was looking to be gracious to those God was gracious to. A man who was looking to be lavish upon those who were serving God well. And Ruth was his example. Now, it might seem that I'm excluding the ungodly, and I'm not. Remember, Boaz was generous to all. But special favor must be given to those who are suffering for the sake of God. And that's where Ruth was. Her life would have been better had she remained in Moab. Her life would have been better if she had returned to her family. That's what Naomi was freeing her to do. And her sister took it. The other woman took it. But Ruth decided she could not leave this elderly woman alone to travel back to a place she had fled from and leave her to find her own way there. And Ruth covenanted to follow Naomi and to commit to her God. And in a strange way, Ruth became the greatest example of a true Israelite that we have anywhere in the scriptures. And she was from Moab. And Boaz recognized it. Do we navigate our lives in this way? Do we look every day at work and in our communities and in our neighborhoods and among our friends for those that God has sent in our direction? Are we even trustworthy enough that God would send someone to us? Can you be trusted to be a Boaz? Does he trust you to be Boaz in somebody else's life?